Hello, and you're listening to your Majesty's Secret Podcast. I like my podcast shaken, not stirred. Only on the Four-Eyed Radio Network. If you'd like to check out more shows, go to foureyedradio.com.
Hey there, Eric here from Socially Awkward Studios, and this Four-Eyed Radio presentation is being proudly brought to you by Raven Designs, illustration and design that fit your personality. For samples and inquiries, visit ravencruise.com.
Bond. James Bond. Shaken, not stirred.
Utter one more syllable and I'll have you killed.
I thought Christmas only comes once a year.
For your eyes only, darling.
I never joke about my word 007.
For England, James?
Come in, Univex. James Bond here.
Am I going to have a problem with you, Bond?
Allow me to introduce myself.
You're that secret agent! That English secret agent from England!
No, you're cleverer than you look.
Still better than looking cleverer than you are.
My God, what's Bond doing?
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
007 reporting for duty.
Hello, the name's Berkeley, Ziggy Berkeley, from Cinema on the Rocks. And with me is Eric Dewey from Socially Awkward Studios and the Trampoline Dancers Appreciation Association of the World. And you are listening to Her Majesty's Secret Podcast, only on the Four-Eyed Radio Network. That's right, this is a show where we talk about bondage, James Bondage, 007 bondage. And today we're going to be talking about thrilling cities.
Dum, da, da, dum.
Specifically, we're going to be talking about the book by that title that was published by Ian Fleming in 1963, which in and of itself was a reprint of two different series of articles that he wrote for the Sunday Times, basically travelogues of going to different cities around the world, first one of which was published in 1959, I think, and the other 1960. Is there that, or 58 and 59? No, it's 59 and 60. So a little bit of a travelogue, though it's less of a travelogue than it is Ian Fleming delineating his own personality.
Yes, very much so. It's a very interesting read. I'll just say that right up front. If you think you're going to get actual tips about traveling to these cities, think again. First of all, even if there were, they would be woefully out of date at this point, of course. But even at the time, they weren't guidebooks by any stretch of the imagination.
At least not that kind of guidebook.
If you were looking for very specific types of entertainment in these cities, you might have found some tips and tricks in these travelogues. But unless you were in the market for those particular devices, no. What's interesting to me is that most of the time it ends up being just a story about something that happened to him at some point, most of the time not even involving the city in which he's located or the time that he's actually writing the story. It's something that happened in the past or something that happened somewhere else. It's just kind of amusing how he kind of goes off and then ties it back together somewhat at the end and be like, oh, by the way, we're talking about this city.
Yeah. And then after that, we're going to be going through a list of the top 10 thrilling cities from the 23 Eon 007 films, and possibly Never Say Never Again. One never knows, because we're only going with 10. But before that, just this past week, if you're listening to us in real time, they finally started filming what had been called Bond 24, which will be released in November 2015. And they finally gave it a title.
Yes, they did.
And as the speculation had been rampant, it was proven true. They are, in fact, going to go back to talking about Spectre.
Yeah, they made sure that rumor was pretty much confirmed 100% by titling the film Spectre, which I'm totally okay with. I know I've heard both sides of this. I've talked to other people who are fans of the franchise, and some people are like, yeah, and other people are like, oh no, couldn't they just have let it be? I'm on the yeah side personally. I was very excited to hear this. I'm very curious to see what type of modern twist they put on the Spectre organization, and I'm excited. I'm excited for it. What about you?
I like it. I think that it's if you're going, since we're rebooting the franchise, as of the last 3 films, and if you're going to bother buying the rights back, you had to do it for a reason.
Right.
The only thing I'm concerned about is if they do decide to film in some form of Spectre trilogy, which it doesn't sound like they're going to do because they've given a plot outline and it's not really one of the books we've already seen. So my concern is Daniel Craig aging himself out before this arc gets completed. Yeah. That's my one concern, because he has said he will retire out of the role if he thinks he's too old, and they're taking way too damn long in between films. So my personal instinct, and this is not a rumor, this is not any form of official speculation, this is just my personal instinct, is we got 2 movies left in him, and this is one of them.
You heard it here, folks. Take it to the bank. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah,
but
I would agree.
If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and I'd like to be, because I like Daniel Craig, but that's one concern I have.
Yeah, if they keep this current pace, I don't think that he can do more than this one and another one. So I think you're right on that. Now, if they were able to step up the pace of production a bit and actually put out a movie every year or something like that, then we could easily get 2 or 3 more after this one. But at the current pace of production, you're absolutely right. That I don't think, unless they specifically write a story for an old Bond, which we've seen them do in the past, it's not going to work. And I think Daniel Craig's smart enough to know that that's hurt the franchise in the past and doesn't want to be a part of that if it's going to go down that way again.
Yeah, and as you may remember, in the original incarnation of the Eon films, when they first started making them, they were pumping them out 1 a year, every year. And personally, I like that kind of pace for a franchise. Now, I understand why they don't do that now. And it has nothing to do with principal photography. Principal photography, you can do it that quick. It is a matter of 2 things. Only one of which to me is legitimate. The legitimate part is post-production has vastly increased the amount of time it takes simply due to the quality and the intricacy of special effects. Post-production usually takes a lot longer than principal production. And the fact that they're first starting to film Spectre now, and it's going to be released in less than 365 days, I just got to imagine they've already done a fair amount of pre-prod. If that is not the case, then 3 years between movies was too long. And then, of course, the second reason is marketing, which to me is bullshit. Just always.
They got to build the hype.
And you can build the hype better by having it go every 2 years, every year and a half, or even every year. And there's no reason you can't film in a fashion like they do for Lord of the Rings. Okay, fine. You want to save some time and effort and location cost? Film 3 in a row. And it's not that hard to do.
Yeah.
Now, it's harder on the actors who are not used to working in old school Hollywood where you could conceivably actually work the entire year, as opposed to you take a role, you film, you're off, you take a role, you film, you're off. Now, your day-to-day journeyman actor, that's not going to happen. But for a lot of stars, they'll only do 1 or 2 a year.
Yeah.
And not necessarily do anything in between. Some do, some keep themselves busy with stage and such, but it depends on the actor. But I don't like this 3 years apart thing.
Yeah, it's far too long, especially as fans, to have to wait and just speculate and think, what's going to happen. At least now we are at that point where we're less than a year out. We know a little bit. We can speculate. We can have fun guessing at what's going on. I hope there's not any big leaks. Sometimes these movies, when they're so long between when they start and when they're released, that's much more time for leaks to happen. That's much more time for somebody who has their hands on a script to decide, hey, I want some imaginary internet points and make people like me, so I'm going to scan this in and upload it to the internet, and boom, the script's online. If that happened, I would want to not read it, but at the same time, I would not want to have it spoiled by other people who may have read it, so it's very possible that I would sneak a peek if something like that happened. So I don't want it to happen so that I'm not tempted.
If something like that happened, 1, I would not read it, and 2, I would not discuss it. on the show.
No, we definitely wouldn't discuss it on the show. We spoil the heck out of movies, but not until they're actually out.
Yes, that's the key, you see.
We'll speculate, we'll guess, but if there's actual spoilers, we won't, we may discuss the circumstances in which the spoilers came out, but we will not discuss the actual spoilers themselves. So, spoiler alert, that's not going to happen.
Right. Now, one thing I do like about the lead poster, this is actually of the Daniel Craig era. Already, this is now my second favorite poster of the Daniel Craig era. The first one, of course, being the one that I voted for Casino Royale in our posters episode, where you have Craig sitting at the poker table with the gun in front of him. I really like that one. I also really like this because you've got the bullet hole, but the way that the cracks spider out, it forms the octopus, which us diehard fans know is the symbol of classic Spectre. Yeah. I really like that.
Yeah, I really dug that. Did you see the 16-second teaser? Which was, I honestly, I haven't watched it with sound, so I don't know if there's any sound other than a gunshot. But it actually starts with the black background, and then you see the bullet hole appear, and then the lines crack out. It's pretty awesome.
I also like the casting so far, and I believe that we have a piece of disinformation. This is, again, speculation, because we have Christoph Waltz as the person who's being billed as our main villain, and they have officially called him Oberhauser. Now, I do not think that they went to all the trouble to buy all these rights back to then screw with names. So I think Spectre is still going to be the special executive for counterintelligence, terrorism, revenge, and extortion. If it is anything else, that'll suck to me. And I think that with Christoph Waltz's character being called Oberhauser, it is either a piece of disinformation so that everybody is thinking, well, he's not Blofeld then. And then we find out sometime during the movie that he is actually Ernst Stavro Blofeld, and he's just using another name. We have seen this before.
Yes.
Or we could find out he's a Largo-type figure, where he is a major player, but he is not the head of Spectre, and instead we still have a dude behind a screen with a white cat.
There you go. Yeah, as far as the anagram for Spectre, I'm of two minds on this, because first of all, no, I don't want them to change it. I don't want them to actually change it. It would be, to me, a little bit of a letdown if they came up with something else for it. However, I do also find it a little bit cheesy for the modern Bond. For the modern Daniel Craig Bond, that just seems a little too cheese-filled for me. So I would be perfectly happy with them just not assigning an anagram for it. Just having that be, that's their code name. They go by the code name Spectre. That's it. It doesn't mean anything, or if it does mean something, they don't actually spell it out, so to speak. Because I think that would walk the line for me personally. No, they haven't changed it. The diehards like us know what it stands for, but actually saying that in a Craig movie, unless they intentionally make fun of it when they say it, which would also be disappointing, it doesn't seem to fit for me personally. But we'll see what they do, and we'll see how they do it, and then we can discuss it then too.
I think it all depends on how the line is delivered. And like we've discussed, when we've talked about Sean Connery in the movies that he's been in outside of Bond, a lot of the times the reason the roles work that he's in is because he's in the role. If anyone else is delivering his dialogue in The Rock or Entrapment, it's just dumber than a box of hammers. But because he is delivering the dialogue, it's okay. It flows. It works. So I think it just depends on how it's delivered. And I think that if you're going to buy it, you're going to buy it all in. I never had a problem with the anagram Spectre. I thought it was actually creative, clever. I never thought it was dumb or cheesy. Now, S.H.I.E.L.D., on the other hand, that's frickin' cheesy. Just
but
saying.
On the bright side, they did make fun. They did purposely. They're like, oh, here's what it means. And one of the characters in the, I think it was in the show, or was it in Avengers? And they're like, it looks like somebody really wanted that to spell S.H.I.E.L.D.
Yeah. And
so I'm okay with that, because that's more of a tongue-in-cheek type of franchise as it is, and so was Bond when this when Spectre originally came on the scene. But we also have heard from Daniel Craig himself in interviews that they are planning to bring a little bit more of the old Bond cheesiness back into the new franchise.
I think a lot of people have been asking for it.
Yeah. Well, he said in interviews that basically Austin Powers ruined it. He said we couldn't put any of the classic cheesy gags in the new movies because they'd already been spoofed by Austin Powers. They'd already been made fun of, and it would just come off as, old hat at this point. So they had to make those first movies very serious and, so much more dramatic, which I'm okay with because they were so good. But he said that it is time for some of that to reappear. So, maybe that's where they're going with this. They're like, okay, we're going to go ahead and throw this back in there, and that'll be where we're going with it. I'm going to watch the heck out of this movie regardless, so I guess it doesn't matter too much, but hopefully shortly after the movie comes out, we'll be able to talk about it. Wonder how long we should wait before we spoil it, though. That's the tough call. How can we actually discuss a movie without spoiling it? Is that something that we can possibly do?
Well, the other thing is our audience does have a choice because this is not live.
That is true. That is very true. But I don't want to limit people too much either. Well, we'll get to it.
We'll figure it out.
We've got a year to figure it out.
So, audience, stay tuned. You've got 11 months.
Let us know what you think.
Almost to the day. Real close.
Yeah, there you go. Let us know. In fact, hit us up on Facebook, facebook.com/HerMajesty'sPod, or on Twitter @HerMajesty'sPod, and let us know. How long do you think we should wait before spoiling the heck out of Spectre?
Now, bear in mind, the earliest possible is going to be the night after it premieres in the United States.
Right.
So we won't, for those of you in Britain, because it always premieres earlier in Britain, we won't be spoiling it for you. At least if you saw it right away. But we will see it basically as soon as it comes out in the United States and be recording very quickly after. So you decide, let us know. If no one lets us know, we'll make an executive decision. And if a couple people let us know and we decide we want to do it the other way, thank you for your input. You'll never know.
We'll figure it out. Like you said, we've got a year. We've got a year to figure it out. So we'll be good to go.
Yeah. But one last point I want to make before we step away from this early Spectre speculation. I do also like the casting of Monica Bellucci as our quote-unquote good Bond girl. She has been trying to be a Bond girl since The World Is Not Enough. And I think she'll be perfect for the role. And I also like the idea that she is age appropriate to Daniel Craig, and that we are not taking the, say, Tanya Roberts route of this could be a grand relative. So, not that Daniel Craig is quite that old, but we're getting to the point where basically if someone's just old enough to drink, they're a bit young for him. Yeah. So,
yeah, I agree. We've seen that in our Bonds. We've seen the younger women chasing and whatnot. We don't need that particularly. I don't think that adds to the character. So I'm perfectly happy with him hooking up with somebody more age appropriate for him, as you said.
Though, with that said, if that's how you found your true love in real life, more power to you. May, December, cool. As long as everybody's legal, I don't care. It's just in the Bond movies, it's something that comes out as being very noticeable.
Yeah.
So, for the purposes of drama,
yeah,
I like this choice.
Right.
But with that said, we're now going to travel way back in time to 1963, or if you prefer, even earlier, the late 1950s, and talk about Ian Fleming's travelogue, Thrilling Cities.
Yes. As we said at the beginning, it was a very interesting read. Perhaps not for the reason that it was originally intended, however. These travelogues, so to speak, end up telling a completely different story than what's going on in these cities. It's more kind of another look into Fleming the man, the guy who, I don't know about you, but other than the fact that it'd be like, oh my gosh, it's Ian Fleming, you wrote the Bond books, I would love to sit down and have a drink with you, but at the same time, I don't think this is a guy I want to just hang out with. I don't know how you feel about that.
I will say that, and this is something that you basically have to, at least in my perspective, have to consider when it comes to dealing with an artist of any sort, a writer, an actor, painter, whatever kind of artist. Like any human being out there, they are going to have good and bad qualities about them. Some have more of one than another, but we all have some of both. And especially when it comes to people of extreme creativity, they tend to flow to extremes on either side. And usually the art for which they are admired is their good side. Now, there are some genuinely wonderful human beings who are creative people and artists and writers and so on. Ian Fleming is not one of them. Ian Fleming is as he describes himself on page 7 of the edition of Thrilling Cities that we are reading from. Ignorant, narrow-minded, and bigoted. That is his own words. His exact quote is, ignorant, narrow-minded, bigoted, of course I am. That is his exact quote of himself, and frankly, he spends the entire book proving it. He is an old-world British colonial racist of the sort that was already out of date by the time he came into his own as an adult. I mean, this is the kind of stuff from turn of the century when you still had as in not this past century, but the one before that, when you still had a British Empire, as in a real empire. And he's very much an unpleasant person, and he spends the entire book telling you how unpleasant he is. That said, he's interesting.
Yes, he is. That is true.
To most modern sensibilities of what would be considered civilized persons, Fleming's just not a nice guy. And he's also an incredible hypocrite. I mean, he talks about people being God-fearing and so on, and I'm looking through this book, I'm like, dude, you're going straight to hell if you actually believe in this. So either you don't take your religion seriously, or you are a total hypocrite, one or the other. Just give it up now.
Right. Yeah, you get a lot of those moments where you're just like, oh, geez, really? Really, Ian? Come on now. But at the same time, you do get a very interesting insight into the man who wrote these stories. So it's kind of interesting on both sides. But yeah, if it weren't for the fact of his writing, of characters that we all love, this would not be the kind of guy I would want to hang out with.
Yeah. But with that said, going through the anecdotes, because that's what this really is. It's less of a travelogue than it is a book of anecdotes. He'd go to this city and he would either bitch about something related to the city that that may or may not have necessarily had to do with something he did while he was there, or he would talk about somebody he schmoozed with or met while he was in the city by prearrangement, because Ian Fleming, the person, was also quite the world-traveling socialite. So that's one of the reasons that he was asked to do these articles for the paper, was that he had all of these connections. And as a piece of history, looking into the lens of what was the world like in the Cold War era, post-World War II, but just before the Berlin Wall went up. Because we'll be talking about this in a few moments. When he goes to Berlin, the wall isn't up yet. It's up by the time the book is published. But when the newspaper article is published, there's no Berlin Wall. Mm-hmm. That hasn't happened. And just a slice of that history, for anyone who's interested at all in what the world was, this is worth reading.
Yeah. In fact, I was going to say, I think the most interesting chapter for me was the Berlin chapter. That was the one that I got the most out of when reading it.
I'm not sure which one was the one I got the most out of, because there was a little bit there were a few that really stood out. That was one of them. But there were a few others as well, and we'll talk about those as we go through them. So let's start from the beginning and go with Hong Kong.
Hong Kong, yes.
The story for which is not really so much about Hong Kong, but how he got there.
Yeah, a lot more details about the flight to Hong Kong than just about anything else.
Yeah, he discusses the flight to Hong Kong, which for him travels through the Middle East and Lebanon, and he goes on at a fair amount of length about how the Middle Eastern Arabs are not to be trusted, how they're all thieves, and to prove this, whether this story is true or not, you get to decide. He decides to, after having warned his traveling partner about how thieving these brown people are, sure enough, his traveling partner's camera gets stolen. Oops.
And of course he uses that as proof positive that all of his bigoted, narrow-minded, ignorant views are absolutely 100% correct, because that happened to happen.
Yeah, and again, that was a direct quote from him. That's not my insult, that's his. So...
Yeah, I agree. It was interesting read, and it was, it opens the book up. It leaves you no doubt as to what kind of person you're going to be hearing from through the rest of the book. At least he doesn't hide it. Right from the beginning, you get a taste of what you're going to be seeing. So I thought it was interesting from the sense of, again, just getting another window into the person who was Ian Fleming. But definitely don't agree with much of what went on there.
Now, once he does get to Hong Kong, again, this is not your standard travelogue. This is Ian Fleming going for what Ian Fleming is interested in. So specifically, to quote a little bit from here, the girls, thanks to the cheongshams they wear, have a deft and coltish prettiness which sends Western women into paroxysms of envy. The high, rather stiff collar of the cheongsam gives authority and poise to the head and shoulders, and the flirtatious slits from the hem of the dress upwards, as high as the beauty of the leg will allow, demonstrate the sex appeal of the inside of a woman's knee that has apparently never occurred to Dior or Balmain. No doubt there are fatter, dumpy Chinese women in Hong Kong, but I never saw one.
They keep them hidden away.
Yeah, so this gives you an idea of what Ian Fleming is looking for when he goes traveling. And this will come up again and again because more so than anything else, he will point out the ins and outs, so to speak, of the local sex industry.
Yes, that's the one thing I noticed. That was the only part of the travelogue that I thought might be useful to some people. They'd be like, okay, well, the regular guidebook I pick up at the airport isn't going to tell me this, so here we go. You could tell what's on his mind, even though there's a couple of points where he mentions his wife. Not really mentions her in any capacity of description or anything like that, just the fact that she exists. You can easily forget that through some of the rest of the writing.
In fact, there's only one city in which he mentioned she was along, and I don't think she came for the entire road trip that he takes. I think she probably flew in and joined him for that city to meet that particular friend. We'll get to that when we get to the city, which is toward the end of his trip. But otherwise, with how he's specifically describing these particular establishments and so on, and there's so much of these little vignettes that you can tell has nothing to do with the trip he took. But these particular things he's describing as being in the moment. And even though he doesn't flat out say it, he's picked up some hookers while he's been on these trips. I mean, there's just, if you don't think he had sex with women who were not his wife while he was on these trips, I think you're deluded. I mean,
I can
maybe I'm totally off base, but I don't think I am.
No, and I agree. I mean, like you said, he paints them in a light of this is something that maybe could have happened in the past, maybe, but the knowledge is too fresh, it's too current. It's pretty much the only thing current about a lot of these trips. So I think very much that he used this as an excuse to go on a worldwide whoremongering trip.
Yeah, and particularly when he gets to Hong Kong, he goes on about the truth behind the story of the world of Susie Wong, which, if you'd like to know, look it up. It's a rather famous story. But so he goes into the what was true, what wasn't, and how the local whorehouse decided to make a profit off of that legend. So no, you can't visit her, but you can visit her very good friend.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also drink Mexican beer in Hong Kong. All right. And so another thing that I find interesting is at the establishment where we're talking about Susie's friend, there is a neon sign out. Girls, but no obligation to buy drinks. Clean surroundings. Enjoy to the maximum at the least expense.
Well, hey, somebody knows their marketing. You see that? You're like, all right.
And then each of these vignettes goes on for about, depending on which one, maybe 10, 20 pages. And then at the end, you'll have something called incidental intelligence, which you can basically take to the bank as something that Fleming did not do on this trip. This is either gathered from times he's been in the city before or flagrant robbery from someone else's travel guidebook. Let's face it, you have to know it was, especially when he says, and this is not to be missed, when he went on earlier about how he would never go to this kind of tourist trap. So did you get that sense that about 3/4 of the incidental intelligence was no personal experience?
Yeah, I did, especially since there were so many things mentioned in the incidental intelligence. It was just kind of like, okay, here's a listing of locations that happen to be there. There was no real flair behind it. There was no real story behind it. There was nothing to make me think that this is something that Fleming himself had actually experienced, whether on this trip or on any previous trips. So I began very early in the book to kind of skim over those bits fairly quickly without reading too much into them, because it was just kind of a at the very, the most interesting thing I got out of it was like, man, look how cheap hotels used to be.
Yeah, that's another piece of the history. I mean, a 5-star hotel for $20, a standard hotel for $5 or less. It's just, the prices are insanely cheap. And the plane he's describing that he's flying on when he's taking these trips, that's one of the first commercial jetliners ever. So, like I said, this is a historical document. And it's a document not just of the cultural history of a dinosaur like Ian Fleming is, but also the cultural history, and the just commercial history. It's just fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that's really the only interesting part I got out of the incidental intelligence sections, was just kind of skimming over and looking at, like, they're talking about a 5-star hotel, and they're saying, what is this one here? Ranges from Hong Kong $36 to $75, which, okay, I'm like, okay. But then I'm like, oh no, that's Hong Kong dollars, which he points out about 8 Hong Kong dollars is 10 shilling. So not a lot of money in comparison to today's money, of course, but, inflation, bitch, what you gonna do?
And another thing that's interesting in these vignettes is that he'll point out things which, to the modern audience, it seems like, why are you pointing that out? He describes in detail what sushi is. It's like, everybody now knows what sushi is, but you wouldn't necessarily know that at the end of the 1950s or in 1963 when this was published as a book. So it's these little differences between then and now that make this a worthwhile read.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. It was definitely an interesting read. Whether or not we like the man or not, it doesn't matter. The read was interesting, and so I would recommend anybody who's a fan of Fleming's work and the Bond series or anything like that, definitely pick it up and give it a read.
And that brings us on to his second city, Macau. And in this particular story, he is going on mainly about gold smuggling. So if you want to know what things are like in the city of Macau proper, aside from gold smuggling and also where to gamble and pick up hookers, you're out of luck. But if you would like to hear him talk to someone who's supposed to be the biggest gold smuggler in Macau and have Fleming basically insult his musical abilities and so on and so forth, then, hey, this is your story.
Yeah, this is another one of those ones where you really don't get a whole lot of city information, but it is an interesting story, and he tells it well, so there's that.
Yeah, we get to find out about the infamous Dr. Lobo. So, Dr. Wolf, apparently.
Oh, yeah. I was like, wait, what? Oh, yeah, okay, I get it. Took me a second. He was
supposed to be the head of the most corrupt gold smuggling operation in Macau, and the reason that gold smuggling is centered here is because of certain taxation benefits, which means you can get gold really cheap there and then just take it off to, say, mainland China and sell it at a massive profit. So Fleming manages to get an interview with this gentleman, basically spends the entire article belittling him to death, to the point where you gotta wonder if after this article came out, because Dr. Lobo had to have read it, how Ian Fleming got away with not having a contract put out on him. Because there's some major slander going on. Not that Dr. Lobo doesn't seem to deserve it, but it's just a matter of caution to the wind. Ian Fleming throws it.
Yeah. Evidently he either knows that he's got fans. Maybe he thinks that he's going to get away with it because he knows they're a fan. Or he really just wasn't thinking it was all that. So, very interesting, but doesn't really tell you a lot about traveling to Macau, unless you wanted to do some gold smuggling.
Yeah, if you want to do some gold smuggling, then there you go. But instead, we're just going to go right on to his next city, Tokyo. And the most interesting detail I got out of here, this book was written before You Only Live Twice. At least the article, let me rephrase that, the article from which this book derives was written before that. And you can tell now where Tiger Tanaka got his name. Specifically, his friend Tiger Saito, editor-in-chief of This Is Japan, whom he met in this particular vignette. And of course, another thing that I kind of suspect, based on the description of the gentleman, his traveling companion through some of Asia is a guy named Dick Hughes, who sounds very much like an analog for Dicko Henderson, and they seem to have a very similar personality, even though Dicko in the book was much more boisterous. I suspect that there's a bit of a lift here. Did you catch that?
A little bit, yeah. I started to. I was kind of curious as I was going through this book, and I was thinking of the Fleming books that had taken place in these cities, wondering, hey, how much of this was pre the Bond book that happened here and how much of it was post.
And of course, once he gets to Tokyo, the first thing that he has to deal with is being a 6-foot-tall white man who is used to things like standard plumbing and so on. And he goes into a hotel built for shorter people where walls are made of rice paper, and he has absolutely no idea how to use the toilet.
Yeah, he complains about a lot of things in Tokyo. I noticed that. It was mostly complaints. I felt. That's the impression that I got when I was reading. I was like, he really didn't like being there very much.
Yeah, and afterwards, he claims that it grew on him, but after he's lofted so many insults at it, it's kind of a mixed bag type thing. So you don't really know if it's him deciding to do the better part of valor thing, or if he really did change his mind. If he changed his mind, then he also decided not to color his early opinion, in which case I kind of applaud that, but at the same time, he doesn't bring a convincing case for changing his mind later.
I think he was just mostly disappointed when he found out the geishas were not actually prostitutes. I think that was the big letdown for him, and from that point forward, Tokyo just didn't have the appeal.
Though I also noted that particular outing also seems to be the inspiration for the scene from You Only Live Twice, the book, where you have the gigantic drinking sessions at the geisha house. I remember that was one of the scenes that stuck out for you in the book, too, where he's just getting sloshed.
Yeah, we had discussed how it seemed out of... Bond drinks, yes, we know this. We know he has a high tolerance for alcohol because he drinks a lot, but never loses control. But in there, he was 3 sheets to the wind. And, you could definitely see where that inspiration came from. So he may not have enjoyed being there, but he certainly enjoyed writing about it afterwards.
And he also enjoyed needling the reputation of a soothsayer who he went to see, who he had no faith in to begin with, and proceeded to gleefully explain how often and how many times that he was wrong.
Yes. And was that the same one of whose death he pointed out? There was a story in a newspaper?
No, he pointed out that the guy's competitor, who read for him, had met with an untimely end. And he wondered if the soothsayer he talked to had told his competitor, hey, you go die.
Yeah, all in all, it makes Tokyo sound like a fairly interesting place because it makes it sound kind of like, well, he disliked it so much. Maybe I need to check this out. I don't know. It's just a weird reverse psychology thing for me, perhaps.
And then the other bit from this particular vignette that gets lifted out into a Bond novel is the double Friday the 13th.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, he's flying double Friday the 13th because he's crossing the international date line while flying on Friday the 13th, so he gets to be on Friday the 13th twice. And Bond himself only experiences that once, but it's bad enough. So that's one more thing that you see pulled from here into the book. So again, as a supplement to the Bond books, this is also interesting because you can see some source material.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, I remember that scene when he was talking about it, and then, of course, just about everything that could go wrong with that flight goes wrong. But they still managed to... everything comes out okay, evidently.
Just like when Ian Fleming flies from Tokyo to Honolulu, everything that could possibly go wrong does. In fact, more goes wrong because the plane is forced to make a emergency landing, and he's stuck on a military base for a little while before he gets to take off again. And then when he goes to Hawaii, the first thing that he has to point out is how fat, old, and ugly all the tourists are. He goes on and on about how there are no hot-looking people on the beach, how these dreadfully old people who just look awful in muumuus or less, and just how they need to get some attractive people in Hawaii. So obviously this is before the Hawaii Five-0 and all this beach revolution came out or something, because I've never heard that complaint about Hawaii.
I've only heard it from people who actually live there, who have to deal with tourists all day, every day, and more. It's less appearance than behavior that they complain about. But it was very interesting how he evidently he just hit a bad batch or something. Maybe he ran into a tour.
Yeah, and honestly, that's all I got out of his trip to Hawaii was that he thought people were fat, old, and ugly.
Yeah, there wasn't much else going on in that particular section. It seemed to me, and especially with Hawaii being the first, he didn't seem to care much for any of the American cities. He even combined Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Didn't even do separate entries on those two cities. And they also seemed much shorter than anything he wrote on any of the other cities anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, he's in fact when he moves on to Los Angeles, which is his next stop. Damn if you're going to learn anything about Los Angeles except that he has very specific opinions about a particular hotel in Beverly Hills, which he thinks is massively overrated, and he also does not at all believe in due process of law. That is his speech in Los Angeles. Instead of talking about Los Angeles itself, he speaks with a friend of his in the police department, and they go on about how it is really awful that you can't just arrest people on sight with no probable cause.
Yeah.
I mean, especially listening to this from a present-day perspective where police are getting out of control. To have him give this whole harangue, I mean, he goes on for pages about just how awful it is that police who just think somebody seems to be in the wrong place can't stop somebody, roust them, arrest them, because you're letting criminals get away without even though you don't know a crime has been committed. That person just looks funny. Or, why are they driving that car? Let's stop them. It's, what?
Yeah, they're very upset by the fact that illegal search and seizure laws exist.
Yeah, and it's just kind of... I was actually really disgusted by reading that. Then nothing about Los Angeles beyond that.
Yep, that was basically it.
And then we moved on in the same vignette to Las Vegas. And the main thing he comments on, and everybody comments on this, and I have to admit it's worth commenting on, the oxygen bars.
Mm-hmm.
They exist in other places, but they're ubiquitous in Las Vegas, and more so than anywhere else, where it's just a stand you walk up to, and Michael Jackson style, you put on a mask and breathe in some oxygen. And that's it.
Yep.
And that's...
It gives you a very brief, very mild high of sorts, and that's it. It can be abused like anything else because your body can only process so much. But, it's not really anything spectacular either. It's not a long-lasting buzz or high or energy or anything like that. It's very short-lived. But, hey, some people love it.
Yeah, and for those of you wondering, but hey, don't we breathe oxygen and need it to live? Yes, we do. However, the air that you breathe is only about 1/5 oxygen. Most of the rest of it is other stuff.
Yeah.
So you are not breathing 100% oxygen. Not unless you're on a machine where you got tubes up your nose because you've got something severely wrong with you.
Right.
And, that's called a medical condition. The average person, you're getting along just fine on low-grade oxygen.
Yeah. So that shot or bump of pure oxygen does give you, it over-oxygenates you, and it makes you feel good. But it's not a high like you would get from, a narcotic of some sort, and it's definitely not long-lasting. It passes very quickly because your body processes the oxygen, and you're back to normal. The one good thing about it is there's not a big crash like there is with some other drugs. Even caffeine and sugar will give you a crash much more than oxygen will, but for what most oxygen bars that I've seen charge way too much for the mild bump you get from it. But
so have you partaken of the oxygen bar yourself then?
I have once. We had one here in the valley for a little while, and I don't think it did very well because it was overpriced, and I actually had a friend purchase my trip for me, and we went in, we sat down, and they had different flavors available. You could, I think I had cherry oxygen, cherry flavored air. Basically, it's not flavored so much as scented. You don't really taste it, but that was. And I remember I was like, all right, okay. And then by the time we had hit the parking lot on the way out, it was like, okay, well, I feel normal again.
Well, that must have been unusual for you.
It was. I was like, I need to get some more of this. No, it wasn't anything special, but, if you're going to do a drug, I guess oxygen is a safe choice.
Yeah, Michael Jackson didn't die of oxygen after all.
That is true.
But otherwise, when he goes into Las Vegas, of course, he's going to primarily talk about gambling. And that is something about which Ian Fleming is actually very knowledgeable. Go figure. And he outlines, this is the first of 2 times he does this in the book, because remember, this is based on 2 separate sets of articles written a year apart. So this is the first of a couple times where you get to hear about the Ian Fleming gambling system. And it's actually a pretty sensible system. It's very similar to the one I use. Yes, degenerate gambler that I am. I won $5 the last time I went to a casino. I put down 20, got 5. So I came out with 25 then. So
all right.
That is actually a good rate of return. If you do it by percentages, that's a 25% rate of return, which anyone who invests in anything would dream of. However, you do not use gambling as an investment. It's just effing stupid. As Fleming himself also points out, and I will do the same, the house will turn against you.
Yes.
It's called gambling for a reason, and the odds are not ever in your favor, okay?
Just all you have to do is look. For me, I just look at the outside of the building. Look at how big, how enormous, how intricate, how much money it had to cost to build these places. And you have to realize they didn't build this place by giving us money. They built this by taking money from us. So you have to know that that's the way the money flows. The direction the money flows is always ultimately in one direction. You can also do the same thing if you stand outside the corporate offices of an insurance company or a bank. Walmart, anything like that. Yes, you can definitely see in which direction the money is flowing.
American hospitals.
Oh, ouch. Sick burn. Yeah. For me, I enjoy gambling in so much as I like to play poker, and I like playing the game. It's not the gambling that makes it that special to me. It's I enjoy playing the game. If I win, great. If I don't, I never play with more than I intend to play with.
Yeah, I go in basically assuming this is how much I'm willing to spend on X hours of entertainment. I could spend the same amount of money at a movie theater, an amusement park, or whatever, possibly even less. Like when I went gambling the last time, I went in with $20. That was all I was going to spend. And I had an hour to gamble. And so that was it. That was going to be my budget. And I never play the max. I play at a very certain level that I know I can sustain my money, but also a level where I'm going to make a profit if I win something. Because if you play a penny slot and you only play one line, you're wasting your time. Yeah. Whereas if you play a penny slot and you do 5 lines at triple money, you can go somewhere with it, that kind of thing.
Right.
So that's basically
the penny slots that have like 18 lines, and you can bet up to 5 coins per line, and you bet the max every single time. You're not really. Why are you bothering with a penny slot at that point?
Yeah. Well, actually, I can't answer that. At that point, the reason you're bothering with a penny slot is you can afford the dollar slot, but the multiplier by doing it on the penny slot, if you're playing a particular game that has bonuses, your bonus round will multiply higher.
I never got into the slot machines. Slot machines, I would spend a couple of dollars on a slot machine if I was waiting for a poker table. That was really the only time I'd hit slot machines. And never with any seriousness. I don't think in my life I've ever sat down at a slot machine. It's always been okay, my name hasn't been called for my 3-6 table yet, so I guess I will, I've got a couple extra bucks here, right in here. And, if it hits, it hits. If it doesn't, it doesn't.
Yeah. And so basically Fleming's advice is if you're gambling with money that you can't afford to lose, you're stupid.
Yep.
And stop when you've made enough money to pay for a steak dinner.
Yes. Yeah, that's kind of his things. He does point out one thing. I don't remember if it's in this one or in the last one, but he says very specifically, and this is something that I would actually agree with wholeheartedly and reiterate, if at any point you find yourself thinking about what you could have bought with the money you're about to bet, stop. Because you obviously want that more than you want to play this game.
Right. So, but that's basically the gist of Las Vegas as far as Fleming goes. So.
Yeah, which actually makes it probably the most informative section of the book in terms of real world knowledge.
Yeah, because again, it is a matter of his personal expertise. So this is the point where a subject matter expert is elucidating on his craft.
Yes.
So, okay, great.
Yes, and it was in this section because he does say, I'm quoting now, above all else, if you catch yourself making a bet and thinking of the things you could buy with the amount of the bet, quit. Never let the amount you are betting become large enough to be important to you. And that's the definitely one point that I would wholeheartedly agree with. If you ever think, as you're putting down a bet, it's time to go.
Yep. Got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. Know when to walk away.
And know when to run.
Yeah. So, we're going to run to Chicago now.
Let's do that.
And one thing that jumped right out at me is this sentence. In Chicago, I had put myself in the hands of Playboy, the new magazine sensation that has already passed Esquire in sales. Playboy is a highly sophisticated cross between Esquire and Cosmopolitan, with a pinch of New Yorker and Confidential added. He never once describes it as a porn magazine.
Never
ever.
Even mentions that, and there's breasts.
Lots of breasts.
So somebody who didn't know and actually read this and said, I'm going to check out this Playboy magazine. Goes and buys one, takes it home to the wife and kids. Got this new magazine Ian Fleming recommended in the newspaper. What?
Of course, if you had that magazine, that would also have been the first place you could have read on Her Majesty's Secret Service. Since that was originally published serially in Playboy.
Well, I'm not knocking Playboy at all, because I actually, at one point in my life, had a subscription. My grandfather had a subscription. I have actually had the pleasure of going through and reading. Yes, reading. I did read the articles as well. Some of the early to mid 70s Playboys, because my grandfather went before I was born, had a subscription, and one time when I was visiting my grandma, she's like, "Oh yeah, there's a whole box of them over there. I just never felt like throwing them away." And I was like, "Really, Grandma? All right."
So he may have read the Jane Seymour issue.
It's very possible. I'm trying to recall. At the time I wouldn't have recognized the name, so I wouldn't have, it wouldn't have ingrained itself. But yeah, and especially back in the day, I've noticed recently it's become less about the articles and more about the images, and it's just the way things go sometimes. But back in the late 90s when I had a subscription, there was still really good articles in there as well. It was a good. I could actually read the magazine from cover to cover and get enjoyment out of it. So in more ways than one. Gosh, dirty minds. Not saying I didn't enjoy that part, but I'm just saying.
And the other thing that jumped out at me as a surprise for the Chicago section, because I fully expected him to talk about the gangland past and have an obsession with ridiculous gang nicknames, which he did. I mean, he is happy to mention everybody's nickname as often as possible. But what surprised me is he wanted to spend an entire afternoon at the Art Institute of Chicago, because after shunning things as tourist traps, he wants to go to the museum. Did that surprise you?
A little bit, yeah. Especially, he starts with Playboy, moves on to gangsters, and then ends up at the art museum. And you're like, wait, what? Really? Okay. I'm down, but interesting combination.
Now, with that said, I completely agree with him. The Art Institute of Chicago is one of the premier art museums in the United States. Its collection is fantastic. I have been there several times. One thing I particularly enjoy that he did not mention is they have one of the best collections of Japanese woodblock prints outside of Asia. And the collection is so large that they rotate it out basically every 6 weeks to keep the prints from being damaged by light. It's in a low light gallery, but even then, light exposure will eventually fade the print. Mm-hmm. So they take the prints out, but they rotate it so often, you can go there for years and years and over a decade, and you will not see the same print twice.
Wow.
Their collection is fantastic. And they have just other fabulous works. Fleming noted the French works. It's just a really awesome museum, and that is something which, from personal experience, I can agree with why he wanted to spend a day there. And interestingly enough, also in this section of the Incidental Intelligence, he talks about Chicago-style pizza, and he mentions that the Chicago-style pizza was originated by two pizzerias, Pizzeria Uno and Pizzeria Due. Uno, of course, has now become a national chain, but it was originally one little Chicago restaurant, and it had its other restaurant very close to it, Pizzeria Due, and that one has not become a national chain. I can tell you Pizzeria Due has some fantastic pizza. I have eaten there. It's very good. That said, if I'm going to eat Chicago-style pizza in Chicago, and you're only going to go to one place for it, I'll pick Giordano's. So that's my recommendation. Just saying.
I'll remember that if I'm ever in Chicago looking for some pizza. I've had Uno's Pizza, not in Chicago, obviously. The national chain you mentioned. There used to be one really close to where I worked when I was working for the movie theater. So we had that on several occasions. It was all right.
It's very different in the local. It's kind of like a Philly cheesesteak in Philly is not the Philly cheesesteak you get at Subway.
Right. I understand that. I understand that.
There's a matter of the local pride going on.
Right. No, I definitely wouldn't anticipate that being the same thing, especially since Subway just kind of all around. But, yeah.
And with that said, we move on from Chicago-style pizza and art and funny gangster names to Ian Fleming in New York. What were your impressions of Ian Fleming in New York?
Well, right from the beginning, even if he didn't say it in the first sentence of the travelogue, I enjoyed myself least of all in New York. That would be the impression that I would have gotten from the excerpt itself. It's almost all incidental intelligence. It's only a few pages of actual information from him, and some of that even is quoted, and credited, of course, but copied from others.
The extensive copy of the City Without a Soul article?
Yes. So there's a good half of what he's written he didn't write. The rest of it is mostly the incidental intelligence stuff, which he even admits at the time of printing was out of date. So, he did not like New York. He was not a fan. And because of that, we don't really get a whole lot of information about it. He just kind of, he doesn't like the steel buildings. He doesn't like the look of it. He thinks it's too tall, too oppressive, and he just does not like New York at all. He wants to get in and out as quickly as possible, and so the chapter goes. It's very short, very quick, and not really a whole lot of information.
No, and that ends his trip for the Sunday Times in 1959. That was his first set of thrilling cities. He then did another jaunt for the Sunday Times in 1960, and I am positive about the years now, where he did the specifically thrilling cities of Europe. So none of those dirty Asians or damn Yankees. No, because we're going with the thrilling cities of Europe, and we start with one that he considers one of his absolute favorite cities on Earth, which kind of surprised me at first, but apparently Ian Fleming really likes hamburgers.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you mean the people from Hamburg?
Yes, the people of Hamburg. He starts in Hamburg, Germany.
Yes. That threw me off the first time he referred to them as hamburgers, because obviously, as a damn Yankee, when I see the word hamburger, I immediately think of chopped meat on a bun. And that's not what he's talking about. He does point out...
In fact, he does point that out, that if you asked for a hamburger in Hamburg, they would look at you really weird.
They will serve you a chopped steak, but if you slice open your roll to put it on there, they will give you the weird look again. Yes,
they call that something else. Tourist food. No.
They're like, oh, you want American sandwich? Okay. Yeah, hold on a second. It definitely a far cry, especially right after he's just gotten done bitching and moaning basically about New York. And then the next thing we read is about Hamburg, and he enjoys it thoroughly. So you get a totally different perspective from Ian Fleming on this one. You'll notice a much longer writing about the actual city itself, very short incidental intelligence section. You can definitely tell he enjoyed himself much more fully in Hamburg than New York.
Especially in the sex industry quarter.
Yes.
See, sinnlich, schamlos, sündig. Sensual, shameless, sinful.
All right. Huzzah, indeed.
Striptease explosive. You get here the strongest beer in the world at the Striptease explosive.
But of course, where else would you find a strong beer? This is where he really starts fully going into a lot of the details of the various sex trades in the cities, starting right here in Hamburg. He is fully appreciative of an open and legal and clean system of basically prostitution and other lesser forms of the sex industry, which I don't disagree with him on that. It's not something that I partake of personally, but I think it should be legal and clean and regulated, and it solves more problems than it causes, I think, to have these things are going to happen.
Yeah,
people have sex. Just this, they do, okay? And if you make it illegal and where you have to go outside of the law to get it, that's when things start turning ugly. And I just don't see the need for it to be vilified the way it is.
I agree with you. And in fact, you'll have study after study that shows that societies that are permissive of this sort of thing tend to be more lawful have less trouble and so on and so forth. And besides that, it's the only thing that you can do which would otherwise be legal that you're not allowed to sell. Like, now notice I said that otherwise would be illegal, because if you don't sell it, you can have sex. That's perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, murder is murder whether you sell it or not.
Right.
So you can't do that.
Yes.
But you can sell your services as a carpenter, as a pool boy. But, you know, why? It's like, I agree with you. It's a outdated concept which very specifically has its roots in primogeniture and making sure that offspring really belonged to a certain father. I mean, we're a couple thousand years past that crap now, huh?
Yeah.
How about
let's move on, folks. Yeah.
But so we actually agree with Fleming on something. Morally speaking, even we agree with Fleming on something.
Which almost makes me feel a little dirty, but that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, but nope, he didn't feel dirty at all in Hamburg. He loves Hamburg. And he didn't even mind the fact that, even though he kind of skirts around it a little bit, he even says that he's okay with legalizing the heterosexual sex trade, but at the same time, without saying it, he's, I would say, tolerant with a small t of homosexuality. He doesn't agree with it, but I don't think you get the impression that as long as people don't go too far in terms of, you know, there's no making out in the street or anything, he won't throw people in jail for it.
Yeah, I think he's very he's kind of segregationist about it. He's kind of like, okay, you guys can do what you want to do with each other, just I don't ever want to see it or know that it's happening.
That, because this comes out as he's describing the sex industry and the very obvious transvestites and so on that he's running across.
Which in some other cities is actually, which kind of confused me, because he does talk later about some other locations that have transsexual shows, you know, drag shows and things. And he was actually very appreciative of the art form of it, which surprised me from previous statements. But it's kind of an interesting, you know, when it's being done for the personal enjoyment of the person doing it, he's like, yeah, keep that to the side. But if it's being done as a show, he's all for it, evidently.
Yeah, and the same thing, and this particularly struck me, especially in this one and the next city he goes to, which is Berlin, kind of a crossover piece here. You have Ian Fleming, the flagrant racist, who admits it. He's a flagrant racist, who nonetheless spent World War II fighting against the Nazis, against the flagrant racists, and therefore in the defense of Jews. And he's talking about Jews in Europe, and he's trying not to be racist because that would make him sound too much like a Nazi, and he hated the Nazis. And yet he goes out of his way to give backhanded compliments or things like, and they really haven't represented themselves very well in that regard. So he's an anti-Semite who feels guilty about it. And that comes out, I think. Did you notice that?
Yeah, a little bit. There were times when it kind of seemed like he was vacillating back and forth, because there were times when he mentioned that the decline of particular cities was due to the Jews having been rounded up and taken out of them. And then in the other, you know, and then he'll turn right around and say something else that takes that completely away. And you're like, oh, well, for a second there, I thought you said that the city would be better with more Jews in it. But now you're not making it sound like that's what you meant. So I'm confused. I'm scared and confused.
Yeah, so you have that conflict of the inner Fleming that especially comes out as he's gallivanting out through Europe and having enjoyed the erotic shows of Hamburg and happily pointing out that they weren't collaborationists. No, not them. He then goes on to another city he does not like, Berlin. Mm-hmm. Now, you said this is the one that struck you the most. Why so?
Well, this one I felt I got the most history from. Like, it wasn't that his view of Berlin was so impressive. It was more just the way he wrote it and the things he wrote about. I think I learned the most from this particular chapter. You know, he talks about, especially since, as you said, this was written before the wall went up, so it's still separate, but it's not. You know, there's not a wall there, you know, so it's very interesting to kind of look back through history through his eyes. And I just felt like when I was reading this, I got kind of a melancholy sense of how things used to be there, and kind of how far we've come since then, but yet how far we still have to go in the world. You know, just kind of, I don't know, just inspired some deep thoughts, I guess.
I also appreciated the anecdote about the American spies who were caught by the Soviets when a telephone cable stopped working.
Yes, that was very interesting. They had basically tapped a trunk line going from one side of Berlin to the other, and before they could, and then something went wrong, and the repair crew said, "Hey, what's all this?" He even found the tunnel leading to where the tap was, where the only thing they could do was hang a sign saying, "You're now entering American space."
Which I thought was very clever. I rather liked that.
What you gonna do? You got to do something, right?
Yeah, and they said, "Well, I'd tap that." So. And then you also have Ian Fleming, architecture critic, who describes the buildings of the New Berlin as an upside-down pack of fags. And by fags, he, of course, is referring to the slang for a pack of cigarettes.
Yes.
So
basically, he's saying they're a big block, which is what they are. They were built utilitarian. They're designed to, we're going to get as many human beings a place to live as possible. And that doesn't always mean comfort and space. That means apartments, which anybody who's ever lived in an apartment knows is basically a square. And sometimes they are cleverly divided so it doesn't feel like a square when you're in it, and sometimes they're not. So
mine's in a vintage Art Deco building with stepped ceilings and a non-symmetrical floor plan, so I get something a little bit different than that. But yeah, the average apartment, pretty square.
Yeah, most apartments I've lived in have been, if you look at the floor plan, you'll see that it is all within a square space. And some of them have been very clever in delineating that space so that when you're in it, when you're traveling through it, it doesn't feel square necessarily. But ultimately, if you look at it, it is, because that's how they're going to pack the most into the space they have available. And the more apartments they pack in, the more rent they can collect, the more money they make. So that's the way they're going to do it.
And meanwhile, Ian Fleming is going to leave Berlin, a city that makes him all melancholy, and he says so. He says he doesn't like it. I think that he actually dislikes... I think that Berlin makes him feel worse than New York does, but he has a more visceral hatred for New York, is what I got out of it. Is that his hatred of Berlin is something that's deeper, more within, whereas New York, it's just disgust. But that was just how I caught it from those.
Yeah.
But then as he goes on to Vienna, the thing that struck me most had nothing to do with Vienna itself. It had to do with how he got there. Because in this particular vignette, we find out what kind of car Ian Fleming drives.
And he's proud of it. He even says, "I make no apologies." And oh my gosh, like, really? For a guy
Were you shocked?
I was. I was like, is that a code word for some sort of British supercar I don't know about? Or is he really talking about it?
Because I remember warning you and you were thinking, nah, no way, I won't be shocked.
Yeah, no, I was very surprised, being that, his characters are always driving around in such flashy things and speed demon vehicles, and here he is tooling around in a Thunderbird.
Yep, a Ford Thunderbird. Not a Bentley, not an Aston Martin, not a Carmen Ghia, not a Lotus, a Thunderbird.
I mean, no, a Thunderbird's not a bad car. I'm not saying that, but you'd think with his money and influence and the fact that he writes about his characters driving such higher-end vehicles that it seems like the passion would be there to go ahead and get himself a nicer car than that. But he loves his Thunderbird.
Not only that, it's an automatic.
Yes. 50 horsepower, 7-liter engine. How inefficient is that?
Well,
that's what struck me as I'm reading. I'm like, looking at this, I'm like, 7-liter engine and he's only getting 50 horsepower out of it?
Yeah, but
holy
come on,
geez.
this is 5960, so yeah.
Well, yeah, it's a flashback. It's like, wow.
Not only that, but the car was also solid steel. It would crush it. As Doc Brown pointed out, it would crush anything of the modern era like tinfoil if it hit it.
Yeah, it's
a tank.
Yeah, it's insane to me. I'm just looking at that thinking, I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm like, my car, I've got a Ford. I drive a Ford Taurus. That's what I drive. And I think it's a 3.2 liter. And I think at its peak when it was produced, it produced around 110 horsepower, something like that. It's not a powerhouse by any stretch of the imagination, but I mean, 50? I'm pretty sure a lawnmower has 50 horsepower. It's a little crazy to me. But hey, for the time, I guess it was good.
But so then he gets to Vienna, and it really didn't strike me that he's particularly enamored thereof. He's not the first travel writer of any sort whom I've gotten this opinion from, where Vienna is supposed to be all this romantic city, and these travel writers, including Fleming, are like, no, it's not what it's cracked up to be, and it really never was. You want Vienna, you have to travel back in time to Mozart. Is that the impression you were getting to?
Yeah, I think what it was for me was I got the impression that he was disappointed but not surprised. Like, I think he knew exactly what he was going into, and he was basically kind of like, yep, that's what I thought. But he was not happy about it. He basically says that it's changed much for the worse, even since the last time he was there, and even the last time he was there wasn't that great.
Yeah, the main thing that made him happy at all in this particular vignette, aside from driving there in his Thunderbird with the automatic transmission, was he talks about the Royal Lipizzan stallions, and he notes how, of all people, General Patton probably prevented them from meeting an awful fate in World War II. That's an interesting story. Seems odd, but okay.
Like, all right.
And he also likes the Vienna Boys Choir.
Yes. He does not like horses.
Which has never done a thing for me.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know. I mean, I appreciate that I'm like, okay, yeah, they're good singers, I guess, for prepubescent boys. But I don't enjoy really the music that they perform. Particularly, I don't have anything specific against it, but yeah, it's never been. Of course, I've never been that much of a choir person, to be quite honest. Like, I appreciate the art form. I'm not going to say that choirs suck and that nobody should ever go listen to them. It's just not for me. I prefer music made by instruments as opposed to strictly voice, but that's just my personal preference.
So basically, you're saying if there was a choir that was doing its art while jumping on trampolines in silhouette, it just wouldn't be your thing.
I would pretty much hate that. Yes.
What if they were singing the praises of Zardoz?
Well, if they were singing a song about being on a trampoline, at least it would make sense. I don't mind trampolines when they make sense.
For those of you who do not understand the jokes, we just referred to the last 2 episodes that we did before this.
Yeah, specifically the opening title sequence episode where... But why the trampoline? That's my problem with the trampoline people. It's not that they exist. It's that there's no reason for them to exist. Anyways, I love trampolines, though. I used to jump on trampolines all the time back before my knees and back really became as bad as they are now. But I'm not a viewer of trampoline sports.
With that in mind, we move on from Vienna to Geneva, where Ian Fleming again does his dichotomy thing. Because on the one hand, he likes something about the Swiss to the point where he even made Bond half Swiss. And yet there is a lot of backhanded complimenting and indictment going on as he's talking about things like the banking system and the too neat society and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Did you get that impression of backhandedness?
Yeah, it seemed like he was appreciative of their... I'm assuming he probably has a Swiss bank account. I think he's appreciative of their handling of money when it suits him. But I think at the same time, he's kind of like, well, this society is all about money. That's all they're about. Everything revolves around money, and it's disgusting. Yet he appreciates that it exists because, it's useful. So yeah, I get that kind of sense from it as well.
And he also rails against the British taxation system as he's talking about places in Europe and how people have to flee Britain, and how he believes in I don't remember if it was in this vignette or in the next one, where he talks about extending his theory of quantum of solace. And in this case, the way that it would go is that people who have somehow contributed to making people happy should be free from taxation, like actors and writers, for example, novelists. Do we know any novelists that Ian Fleming might know who he might want to have exempt from British taxation?
Oh, geez, I don't know. Yeah.
Now, of course, that is an opinion he shares with Roger Moore, who in his own memoir noted how he basically moved away so that he could avoid taxation, and flies in the face of people like Ricky Gervais, who says that he's happy to pay British taxes even though he is a multimillionaire, because the systems that those support are the reason that he got where he is.
Yeah.
So
him and another notable one is J.K. Rowling's, who also says essentially the same thing because she was on public support while she was writing the Harry Potter novels. So she's more than happy to give back and gives back, in fact, much more than she even has to in just taxes. She donates quite a bit. She's actually, from what I understand, she may be the first billionaire to ever lose their billionaire status by donating too much money to charity.
it's a problem I wish more people had.
Yes. Problem I wish I had that problem. I would accept that. I would accept that problem readily.
But the other thing that he talks about when he's in Geneva, and this is where his wife shows up. Now again, given the entertainments he was enjoying in Hamburg, I don't think she was with him in Hamburg. Just call that a guess. I think she flew down to join him in Geneva so that they could have a lovely dinner with his friend, Charlie Chaplin, which is an interesting anecdote in terms of just the dinner conversation. And I especially found it interesting because the only other Charlie Chaplin dinner anecdote I had read before this was him being a horrible joke teller and telling such a stink bomb of a joke that it kind of killed the night. So this was a complete contrast to that. As far as Fleming's experience was concerned, Charlie Chaplin's a gas. So what did you think of that?
I thought it was very interesting. I didn't realize. Sometimes when I think of these older people who are no longer around, I lose track of the time frames in which they actually existed. And so for me, it seemed to me that Charlie Chaplin was in a different era even than Ian Fleming. So when the idea of them sitting down at a table together, I was like, wait, what? That confused me because I just didn't put two and two together. Like, no, they were alive at the same time.
Charlie Chaplin was just an older man. That's all.
It just, it just didn't click at first. I don't put those things together normally. So that was interesting in and of itself. But yes, I felt the conversation was interesting and definitely didn't leave me the impression that he was not a fan.
No, in fact, quite the opposite. I think they got along famously. But then after his dinner with Charlie Chaplin, and I'm assuming he left his wife behind because I don't think he wanted her along for his next dinner date when he moved into Naples. And again, the thing that strikes me here has nothing to do with Naples. It's the fact of his experience having dinner or lunch with an exile living in Naples at the time, Charles Lucky Luciano.
Yeah.
Now that is a hell of a meeting, and I have some definite opinions about it, but I want to hear yours first.
I thought it was very interesting, and again, this is one of those ones where you really jumped out at me is that I learned absolutely nothing about Naples right now. I did, however, learn a lot about Fleming's opinion on the mafia and organized crime, and specifically Lucky Luciano, because he's basically friends with them, and they just hang out and have a conversation. Although I think I'm left with the feeling that Fleming buys into Lucky's story more than he probably should. I think Lucky's version of events is even more sanitized than, I believe that there are some parts of it that were exaggerated, but I also believe that there are other parts that were not exaggerated that he is glossing over.
And I found it especially interesting that Fleming is not only on friendly terms, but flattering terms. I mean, he's swallowing everything hook, line, and sinker with this American gangster when he is so down on American gangsters in his books and everywhere else. So it just seems he's enamored of this one individual. And now I have a pretty fair background in the history of the American Mafia. And not that I have been in the American Mafia, I know a lot about the history of it. And Luciano was a very charming man. And the part that is not explicitly written in this book, and it was not made public at this time. It's public knowledge now, but it was not this close to the end of World War II. Lucky Luciano, of course, was the founder of the modern American Mafia, as far as the commission and the structure of the major families and organized crime being totally organized. Capone was a big figure locally in Chicago in terms of super organized crime in America. That's really a product of the brain of Lucky Luciano. And what he finally got arrested for, this part is true. he didn't do. The one thing that they threw him in jail for, he probably did not do. There's strong evidence saying that it was a frame-up job because they couldn't get him on all the crap that he did, and he did a ton. So he's languishing in prison in New York. Then comes World War II, and they're having lots of trouble at the docks in New York. Now, Luciano's in prison, but he still runs the mob. So the government decides to start making deals with him. And they say, hey, we're having trouble at the docks. Can you help out? And Luciano says, okay. And within very short order, the docks are cleaned up because Luciano has put the word out that, hey, you behave. We got a war fighting here, so we need to do our part. And then when it comes to the point where the Allies are about to invade Sicily, they ask Luciano to use some of his connections in the old country to help them out. So they're getting mafia help for the invasion of Italy. And in exchange for this help, Luciano was released from American prison and exiled to Italy. That's why he's there. That's the part of the story Fleming doesn't tell you. So putting that together with this, and then, of course, Luciano is telling Fleming, I'm not really a criminal at all. No. Yes, he was. He was a pretty nasty one.
Yeah.
But just not necessarily for what he was locked up for, which was a prostitution racket. As far as his philosophy on drugs, the idea that Luciano never dealt drugs is absurd. Of course he did. But his philosophy on what you do about it is actually kind of interesting.
Yes, and another case where I actually kind of agree with both of them. Because again, that's another thing that I think is criminalized and vilified for no real good reason. The fact that it's criminalized and vilified is what makes it so dangerous. It's not the, people... I'm in general against nanny laws. Laws that are there only to protect myself from myself, I'm not that appreciative of. Their laws should be there to protect me from other people. They should be there to protect me from the government, from corporations, from outside influences, that sort of thing, yes. I don't need laws to protect me from me. I should have the choice in that respect. And I think...
So I will say that I'm all for protecting children. Like, I'm sorry, I have no problem forcing you to belt your child into a car. That is not your choice. Well, I'm a parent, I can let the child crawl around. No, you can't.
No, and I don't think of that as a nanny law, because that's more of... That's protecting somebody who is not yet old enough to make their own decision. If at 18 or 19 years old you decide you want to drive around without a seatbelt on, that's on you. But, if you want to be dumb, you want to be dumb. But as a child, as somebody who is not old enough to make that decision for yourself, I agree. The laws are there to protect that child from the parents in that respect. So it's not there to protect the child from themselves. It's there to protect the child from the stupidness of the parents, perhaps.
Yeah, and in fact, I was just reading an article the other day how the legalization of marijuana in the United States is actually hurting the Mexican cartels.
Yep.
They're losing money by the ton, hundreds of millions of dollars to American legalization. Mm-hmm. So there's an effect there. So Luciano, in his talk with Fleming, is saying that the way to handle drugs is not to criminalize it and throw everybody in jail, but instead to have rehabilitation programs.
Exactly. Yeah, and they even talk about how at the time, I guess in Britain, they did have programs like that. And there are some programs like that. I mean, we have methadone clinics and things like that, but it's not the same thing. It's not actually treating the drug addiction itself. And that's... it's the same thing as, for me, I don't see much difference between alcohol and marijuana or cigarettes or, there are harsher drugs out there. But then again, a lot of those harsher drugs were created to combat the illegality of the drugs that were more safe. It's like bath salts, for example, a crazy, disgusting drug that I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy, but it was created because, well, the laws only specify this chemical formula. So if we create this crazy chemical that nobody's defined yet, we can sell it legally. And yeah, it's really, really bad for you, but it's legal for a moment until they figure out the formula and make that particular formula illegal. And I think a lot of that, the constant struggle to define what somebody can put into their own body is more harmful than helpful.
So this is, again, one of those instances where city, you won't know a thing about Naples by the time you're done reading that. I mean, you might know that it's in Italy.
And honestly, I'm not sure if I learned that from reading this or if that was just knowledge I had before going in, quite honestly. I don't even know if that was mentioned.
And he also mentions being kind of disgusted by Pompeii, which is kind of hilarious considering how much he enjoyed the bawdy houses everywhere else.
Right.
And he didn't even get it. Apparently he wasn't even shown the part where they've basically proven by now through modern archaeology that most of Pompeii was a sex district. Everything was about getting laid.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was basically like the Yoshiwara of the Roman Empire.
Right.
But, so, yeah, it's almost all of this is his interview with Luciano, but that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then we move on to basically a rehash of something he already did in his previous set of articles. When he goes to Monte Carlo, it's Las Vegas Light, and he's just talking about his gambling philosophy again. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah, he breaks it down. He breaks down an interesting system to play roulette, I think, involving writing numbers on a paper and betting certain amounts, and as opposed to just a philosophy of gambling as he laid down in Vegas. But it's essentially the same thing.
Yeah, and then you find out, even though he doesn't talk to him, that he's really admires Jacques Cousteau. And at the time of this writing, he's just about to film all of these National Geographic specials. All the ones that just about everyone listening to this grew up with at some point, or at least saw in a science class somewhere. So that's another little bit of cultural history thrown in. So I found that was, and other than that, I got nothing out of Monte Carlo. How about yourself?
Yeah, again, nothing about the city, really. He visited the one casino, talked to the one person, and laid down the gambling system, and there wasn't even any incidental intelligence. He kind of dispensed with that. He was just done with Monte Carlo, done with the story, done with the book, done with the whatever. It's just like, all right, we're done. So,
and then he just ends it all by saying that it'll always be fun to travel abroad.
Yep.
And I bet he thought that had a double meaning.
Oh, yes, I believe that was probably the truth. But yeah, it was a very interesting read from start to finish. There are definitely high points and low points. Again, it proves once again that Ian Fleming was not the type of person that I would personally want to hang out with or be friends with. But he was a very interesting character, and you get to see a little bit more into the person behind the characters in that sense.
And along with getting just his own personal philosophy of things, and also a little snapshot into the cultural and physical history of the world at the time, for fans of Bond, you also get little slices of where some of his stories came from, where some of his characters came from, where some of his ideas came from. So if you're a Bond fan, I do recommend checking this out. Just be prepared to be appalled at some things. And if nothing in this book appalls you, you scare me.
Yeah, I can agree with that. You should be slightly shocked by at least some things here. Otherwise, what are you, some sort of animal, some sort of monster? No, I definitely think it's a good read. It's a very interesting look into the history of the world as well as the history of Ian Fleming.
So that will do it for our discussion of Thrilling Cities, the book by Ian Fleming. By all means, check it out. And if you'd like to check it out, the best way to do that is to go to our website, hermajestiespod.com. And you're going to see a link there to Amazon. Click that link.
Click it.
It will take you to Amazon.com. Now, you could have gone to Amazon on your own, but you want to click our link instead. Why? Because when you click our link and then you buy Thrilling Cities by Ian Fleming, or anything else at all for that matter, do your Christmas shopping, all of it, after you click that link. Because then, at no additional cost to you, we will get a small percentage, and that small percentage helps us keep this show free for you to listen to. So please go to our page, hermajestiespod.com, click on the Amazon link, do your shopping as normal, and we will very much appreciate it.
Yes, we will. It doesn't cost you a dime more. It takes you 2 clicks more, and that's it. And it helps us out in the back end, keeping all the great shows here on the 4-Eyed Radio Network coming at you free of charge. So please do us that small favor. If you're going to shop Amazon anyway, do it through our link.
Yeah. And meanwhile, having paused for that commercial break, we are now going to talk about some of the thrilling cities of the 007 films, using as our fodder the 23 official Eon productions, along with the possibility of Never Say Never Again. Whether or not we use it, who knows? We're going to talk about the top 10 thrilling cities of the 007 films, and I admit I was surprised at how my list turned out in terms of the total composition of it. There are some cities on there. I mean, I bet you have a strong bet as to what my top city is.
I believe I do, and I believe that might be most likely probably the only spot in which we meet up. Unless, well, I mean, this is one of those ones, there's so many to choose from, and we're only picking 10, that it's possible that our lists are completely different. We could have 10 different cities each on here, but I have a feeling that our number 1 is going to match. And very possibly there might be a couple others that we both have on the list, but I'd be very surprised if they end up in the exact same place.
I will also point out that, as usual, Eric and I have not discussed this list before. In fact, I presented no parameters at all for how the cities were chosen. So we may not even have chosen based on the same criteria.
That's very possible. And I fully admit that at least one of mine is sort of iffy at best, but we'll get there.
Because for me, in order to pick something as a city, it had to have flavor as a city. Like, for example, if you only see one specific building in a place and nothing else, that to me isn't the flavor of a city. That's a single location. Or if you're told you're in a city, but in theory it could have been anywhere, and there's not necessarily something that gives you the flavor of what that city is, again, it was off the list. So, and it'll be interesting to see if Eric mentions 2 particular cities that I think he might, that I absolutely could not include, even though I love the scenes in the movie that they're in. So it'll be interesting, and I think I will shock Eric in at least a couple of points on this list, but we will see.
All right. Well, let's get down to it then, shall we? You want to go first with your number 10 spot?
This is one that I think will surprise you,
all right.
Actually. Not shock you, just surprise you, because in our previous discussions, I don't really hold this in high regard as a city of 007, and yet, with how it's portrayed, it works for what it is, and that is New York City, which has been seen on...
Get a rope.
I know, where they don't know where pecani sauce is supposed to taste like. But you've seen it, of course, several times for the fact that it's the headquarters of the United Nations. And all those United Nations shots, I mean, they're important to the Bond universe. It's just because it's a staple location. And so that's there in many incarnations. But also, specifically, I'm thinking Live and Let Die. Because not only do you get the United Nations, you get a travelogue through the city. He's actually driving through town, crossing the Brooklyn Bridge as the Pitmobile comes after him. And this is what specifically sells me going into Harlem. I thought you captured specifically that blaxploitation Shaft era, and I'm referring to that as a time period because that's late 60s, early 70s, that specific era in time of the vibe of that. I think you captured it pretty. I think that went well. So I think just for a flavor of New York for when it was and what they're trying to represent out of it, I went with New York City and special nod to Harlem. Mostly from Live and Let Die, but also appearing in other films. That's my number 10.
Well, Bond is quite the globetrotter, so it's fitting that he would end up in Harlem sooner or later. I will admit I was a little surprised because I did consider that one on my list. It didn't make the list, but it was considered, and I am a little surprised that you had it on your list based on our previous discussions of that film and those scenes. But good choice. I'm not going to question your judgment, but I am a little bit surprised.
All right. So what do you have at number 10, sir?
Now, my number 10, and I put this actually honestly would have been higher on the list if I really, really felt that it qualified 100%. But because I feel that this is a little bit of a cop-out, but I just couldn't not put it on the list because of all the places Bond has been, this is one of the most thrilling for me and one of the most exciting. And whether or not you put it on your list, I think you'll agree on that respect at least. And that, of course, is outer freaking space, man.
I had a feeling you were going to say, once you started introing it.
I know it's not technically a city, but it is a location, a destination that they ended up in. And
we said specifically cities. We did the location episode. That was different.
But this, I don't know. it kept popping up every time I thought. I was like, well, he went to space. James Bond in
Popping
space.
up like a nude girl on a trampoline.
Exactly. Except, more entertaining in this sense because I could see things. But anyways, no.
Eric is not entertained by nude girls on trampolines.
Well, when they're only in silhouette, it's a little, it's like, oh man, somebody turn the light on, turn the light around. But yeah, it was just, as far as thrilling places for Bond to be, I had to include it. So, but I did put it way at the bottom of my list, even though I do find it more exciting and more thrilling than some of the others. I did put it at the bottom of my list because I did feel that it was cheating just a little bit. But
it's cheating a lot. This is not the Thrilling Places episode. It's the Thrilling City. I disqualify your answer, sir. However, there's really nothing we can do about it now. So what do you have at number 9?
At number 9 is one that I feel might... I wasn't sure if you were going to include this on your list or not, and it's one that I feel might be overlooked when thinking about all the places Bond has been, and that is one that...
There's that word places again.
Well, okay, all the cities that Bond has been. This one is a city, for sure. I think this might get overlooked because it's not necessarily a place where he goes, but rather where he's from. And so I chose as my number 9, London. You see it a lot in all the movies, most of the movies at least. You see London at some point or another, and I think it's extremely important in the Bond universe, obviously, as his home base. So whether or not you chose it on yours, I don't know, but I had to put London in there. So there it is, number 9. I'm
going to question your judgment, sir, and I'm not going to tell you why.
Uh-oh. All right, so what did you have then at your number 9 position?
At the number 9 position, this I hemmed and hawed on in terms of meeting my own set of qualifications, but then I decided you saw just enough outside of the one particular location to make it okay, but this was a barely qualified, but as soon as it qualified at all, it's one of those locations where I could never understand why Bond wasn't there sooner. I am, of course, referring to Paris, France, because you had the Eiffel Tower, which is iconic, but you also had the shots of the Champs-Élysées and jumps onto the boat in the Seine River. So, okay, you see enough that's not just the tower that I thought it just barely qualified, but only enough to bring it down to number 9, even though it's a location that you kind of think Bond should have spent a lot more time in at some point, but we only see it for that little brief bit. But when we do, it's good stuff.
Well used. I will question your judgment in as much as one can question a judgment on a short list like this, because obviously there's not going to be too huge differences, but I will say that I am looking at you a little bit sideways. Just a little bit.
Okay. Fair enough.
So moving on to number 8 then, what do you have there?
At number 8, I have a city that I think a lot of people might forget, but in the movie that it's in, you actually see a lot of the city. You get a really good flavor for it. You get not only shots of some of its most iconic landmarks, you also get one of its biggest cultural events, and you get some thrilling chases going through, not necessarily town, but the outskirts, but still enough to make a point. So I am choosing from Moonraker, not outer space, but instead Rio de Janeiro.
Rio.
You get to see Carnival, get the shot of the Cristo Redentor, you get the nice shot of the cable cars at the mountain. You get enough of a flavor of a city that you can tell that this is not just a mock-up of the city, that this is not just going to be something I could have done on the soundstage. This is something where it's definitely a location piece. So I went with Rio. And it's also interesting that Rio was considered for another film as well, filming in the favelas specifically, but it was decided that was too dangerous. So instead they went with South Africa. Of course, I'm referring to Casino Royale. But so my choice for number 8, Rio de Janeiro.
All right. Good choice. I don't disapprove at all. I did not choose that one anywhere on my list, but I don't question your judgment, or I'm not looking at you funny either. I understand.
All right. So what do you have at number 8, sir?
For me, number 8 is one that, from a movie you've already mentioned, but I chose a different city, although in the same country. And that was also from Live and Let Die, but instead of New York, I chose New Orleans. I thought the flavor of Louisiana and New Orleans was definitely present there, and I thought it added to the drama of the film. And even though we know, yes, not all black people in New Orleans are voodoo, but still, you got that flavor, and I thought it was a very good use of the city and the culture of the city without necessarily landmarks, not necessarily, but the flavor of the city I felt was definitely there. So that's why I chose it.
I came very close to picking it. It is not on my list, and that's one of the things that shocked me. It was basically the running battle between that and New York, and I think just the United Nations is what made New York win over. But it was really close, so I'm definitely not questioning your judgment at all. If anything, I'm kind of questioning mine. So
you question your own judgment, sir.
Yes.
Right. So that moves us up to the honored 007 position on the list.
Indeed. And what do you have there?
On there, I have one that we spoke about in the book, although it was used very differently in the movies, being that the wall was in fact up, and that would be Berlin. I kind of counted both East and West because they did kind of use both, specifically in Octopussy. I thought that was a very good use of a city, not only in sense of landmarks and location, but also in the sense of politics. And so that's why it really, more than any other reason that it made this list for me, was that I felt that the politics of the city really added to the drama of the film.
And if it weren't for the fact that they spent only a few seconds in Berlin, I would totally be right there with you, because politically, I think it's one of the most important places that they were. But in terms of getting a flavor for Berlin, there was one location, basically. So that kept it off the list for me. But I understand why it's on yours. But I just couldn't put it on mine.
Okay. It's all right. So
now, with that said,
your number 7
for
spot?
my number 007, I am also visiting a city that was visited by Ian Fleming, except I am going on the other side of the world and choosing Hong Kong, which is one of the quintessential British Empire cities, because, of course, before being handed over to China in the 1990s, it was a British possession for 100 years, one of the crown jewels of the empire, in fact, and it's been used in several James Bond movies to outstanding effect. You've seen it in The Man with the Golden Gun, you've seen it in even Die Another Day, you've seen it in You Only Live Twice, that's where it starts. So Hong Kong has a strong place in the history of James Bond, and I just could not see this list without it, and what better place to put it than the 007 spot.
All right. I will say that I, again, can't question your judgment too heavily, but I agree with your reasonings, and we might talk about it again in a little bit.
All right.
So that moves us up to number 6. What do you have there?
Looking at the realities of geography, area being inclusive of something beyond just the city border. And you'll see why when I mention what the city is, because you have the city, which itself has been used to decent effect in the James Bond universe, in fact, more than once, where you've seen going through the streets and being inside clubs and buildings, you get a flavor for the architecture and so on. And then in a suburb just outside the city, which is photographed way more often, but it's only photographed from one side, because if you photograph it from the other, you will see the city right there. And nobody wants to see Cairo right behind the pyramids. So I've picked Cairo as number 6.
All right. Another one that I will say we'll probably discuss some more in the near future.
All right. So what do you have at number 6? Sir?
For me, number 6 was one that I don't know how much of the flavor of the city we necessarily saw exactly. We definitely got the flavor of the country, and it's such a small country that I kind of equate the city with the country, and I just kind of keep it all wrapped up in one little bundle. And for me, that was Kingston, Jamaica, or just Jamaica in general, if you really want to just boil it down. But if we're picking a city, then I guess that would technically be Kingston. I'd also go ahead and throw Crab Key in there, I suppose, if that's a real place. But I really liked it's where it all began, and that always holds a little bit of sway for me, and it did in this case as well.
Interesting choice. It's not one that I would have picked, but I'm not going to fault your judgment. For me, I wouldn't have picked it because I don't think you see enough of it to get the real flavor of it, but I totally get where you're coming from, so I'm not even going to look at you cross-eyed. I'll just say, okay.
All right.
So what do you got at number 5?
At number 5 is one that you have already mentioned. This is one that was only a couple of spots off from you, and that is good old Hong Kong. Especially, it was featured in many storylines, but specifically I even went with the version in The Man with the Golden Gun because of the upturned ship being the hideout. I just love that part of it. Just adding that history and that little bit of wackiness and flair. It just really sold it for me. But Hong Kong is a great city, and I think they have put it to great use in more than one of the films. So number 5 for me. Your number 7, Hong Kong.
Yeah, it's just such an iconic imperial city. It's one of those where you really can't go without it, and I'm glad that they have put it to such good use. Now, as far as my number 5, it's another iconic city, and it very much fits in with the espionage genre, and it's one where back in the days of Sean Connery and so on, and certainly in the days of Ian Fleming when he was alive, I don't think anyone would have ever thought you would be filming in this location, that it would have even been possible. And yet, when they did, they certainly made the most of it. Of course, by then the city had reverted back to its old name from before the 19-teens, and of course that must mean I'm talking about St. Petersburg, Russia, also known as Leningrad, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, put to wonderful use in the first real post-Cold War James Bond film, Eric's favorite, of course, GoldenEye. And this is one where you didn't just get to see one thing and done. You got a bit of a flavor of the city because you had a wonderful tank tour of it as the tank is just tearing through everything. But you get some nice views of the architecture. You see some statuary. You see the Hermitage, which is, of course, the old palace of the Tsars, which has now become one of the greatest museums in the world. So it's just wonderful to see that once they got the chance to go into Russia, which one has to wonder if they'll ever get that chance again, or at least for a while. Yeah. They took it, and they took great advantage of it. So I was very happy to see St. Petersburg, Russia, put to good use. If you weren't going to go to Moscow, which, let's face it, everybody did as soon as they got the chance, I like also the fact that they went to the old city, the old capital. Mm-hmm. So it just seemed appropriate. And it also was nice to go to somewhere a little bit different, but still iconic. So number 5, St. Petersburg, Russia.
All right, fair enough. That one did not make my list, but mostly because when I went through and did my list, the first thing I did was just list all the ones that I remembered in my brain as far as immediate. And while I thought of GoldenEye, I didn't immediately think of the city. And it might be because there's so many different names. Maybe I just got confused, but it didn't pop into my head. But the scene did. My thought was, what city was that again? Well, if I can't remember it, then it couldn't have been that thrilling. But no, you're right. That one should have made my list as well. So I am questioning my own judgment, sir, on that one. There,
we both did it once. So. And I am frankly shocked, but I accept your explanation and your questioning of your own judgment.
We'll throw that in. We'll go back and re-edit out my outer space answer and put in... no, we won't. But it'll be fun. So that brings us up to number 4, I think, already, doesn't it?
It does indeed. And number 4, now... Of course, the theme song for this movie was done by somebody we're all very familiar with. Of course, we're familiar with all of them because we listen to all this music. But one can imagine that the movie would have even been better served, and I say this facetiously, kind of, because given the tone of the movie, it in fact would have fit extremely well. If instead of Shirley Bassey singing Diamonds Are Forever, we dropped in Elvis Presley singing Viva Las Vegas. Because, let's face it, that entire movie, whether it was a scene taking place in Vegas or not, that entire movie was Vegas. And when they got to Vegas, they went all out Vegas, baby. I mean, they just... You went down the strip, you had car chases through the strip, you had some of the iconic hotels, you got to see some of the landscape around the city, and just circus, and you got just the whole over-the-top glitz flavor of Las Vegas. So Ian Fleming talked just about the gambling in his book, but in the movie you got to see the gambling and much more, and you got to see much more of Plenty O'Toole if you looked really quickly, and of Tiffany Case if you looked really quickly. But yeah, there was no way I could not include Las Vegas on this list just because of the extreme prominence, the extreme relevance to the style of the movie, and just how very, very well done it was. In fact, the fact that it is at number 4 on my list is a testament to how strong, to me, the 3 cities I placed above it are.
Wow. Yeah, I will admit, Vegas did cross my mind. I did think about it while doing this list, and I don't remember exactly. Well, I know that at one point it was on the list, and it got bumped as things got moved around, and I can't remember exactly what my reasoning was, but I know there was a reason at some point that I said, no, this one deserves to be in here, and this one doesn't, and this one deserves to be higher, and this one deserves to be lower, and by the time everything was said and done, Vegas had moved out of the top 10. Although, looking back and listening to your explanation, that may have been an error. But that's why we have 2 hosts.
I can only assume you were drinking.
Actually, I think the problem was that I wasn't. If I was, I'd probably been thinking more clearly.
Well, you would certainly have been in a more Vegas state of mind.
I've been dry as a bone for a couple of weeks now, so I need to rectify that situation sometime in the near future.
Well, my friend Mr. Daniels and I feel very sorry for you.
Yeah. Well, I've been sick for the past week, so it's kind of it's not really.
What, you don't wash down your meds with hard alcohol?
The only I mean I do take NyQuil, the good stuff that you have to sign for at the pharmacy counter, and that has alcohol in it, so I don't add any alcohol to it that's not already in it. So it's about a shot of 20 proof, basically, is what a dose of NyQuil is. It's not really enough to to get you drunk, but it's enough to really help that the sedative in there to work. So
fair enough. So what's next on your list, sir?
For my number 4, this was the one that my most severely questioning of your judgment thus far, because it was so far different from your number 9 spot, and that would be, of course, Paris, France, from A View to a Kill. Just so wonderfully used. I love the fact that they not only showed the Eiffel Tower, we had a fight scene on the Eiffel Tower, a fun fight scene on the Eiffel Tower, no less. Just a great use of the city, I think, as more than just a backdrop, as we've discussed in the past. A View to a Kill really did a good job, I think, using locations, and Paris was definitely one of those locations it used very, very well, and so that's why it made it to my number 4.
All right. I had mine, as you noted, much lower, but I can't really question your reasoning, and it is one of those classical espionage cities, so I won't question your judgment. Except just that we had 2 different ideas about how this city landed on the list.
All right.
Which brings us to your number 3.
Coming in at number 3 is another one that you have already mentioned. This is one that I felt that they not only used the city and, of course, the major landmarks of this city, the obvious landmarks of this city that everybody knows, but they also went so far as to include an actual production show that is performed there, or a presentation, I should say, that's done there in the actual film, and I just thought that was a really clever way to include the city in the film as well. And so, of course, it has to be Cairo in Egypt from Diamonds Are Forever. Just a great use of the location.
And you know what? I think it was used even better in The Spy Who Loved Me.
Yeah, that too. Wait, but they went to Cairo in Diamonds Are Forever, didn't they?
But they did not do the pyramid show
They did
in Diamonds Are Forever. They did that in The Spy Who Loved Me.
All the more reason for this to be this high on the list, because they've gone there more than once. I'm like, no, they were there in Diamonds Are Forever. But yes, you're right. They yes. Oh my gosh, I need to go back and rewatch all the movies again. It's been too long since I've watched them just straight through. Just need to watch them straight through again. That might confuse me more than I already am, but it's still worth the effort. Either way, number 3, Cairo.
All right.
How about for you, sir? What cracks your top 3?
Now, my number 3 is a city you have already mentioned, and it frankly shocked me that it was as low on your list as it was. And if not for the strength of the 2 cities above it, I could not justify putting it any lower than number 3. And that is, of course, James Bond's home base of London, England. Now, had it just been shown as his home base, so if we're looking at essentially the pre-Pierce Brosnan era of 007, then yeah, I could have put it as low on the list as you did, because then you have an establishing shot of a landmark, and then you have M's office, and that could be anywhere. But once you get into the Brosnan era and then into the Craig era, where they start using London as a real physical location for the action, it becomes so much more, especially after Parliament agreed, and it was actually discussed in the British Parliament before they agreed to allow the chase scene for The World Is Not Enough to be filmed along the River Thames and in front of the actual MI6 building. They were wondering if they might want to disallow that as a matter of state security, and a member of the House of Commons, I believe it was, stood up and said, "For all that Bond has done for us, this is the least that we can do for Bond." And Parliament agreed to allow it to go through. And so you have the actual building, you have the wonderful chase along the Thames, you have the Millennium preparation, including the Millennium Dome that everyone has made fun of up and down, so I don't need to. You have the London Eye, and then as we move on beyond the Pierce Brosnan era into the Daniel Craig era, of course, we have what happened in Skyfall, where you have the attack on the building, and then yet another wonderful chase through London as Judi Dench as M is being questioned. But so you have just all of this wonderful action taking place inside of London. And Daniel Craig himself in an interview stated that in so many movies you see London, and to a native Londoner, which of course I am not, but it's interesting to hear this perspective. He said, as a native Londoner, I don't really recognize it. I don't feel it. But when I saw what we did for Skyfall, it felt like London. And that says a lot to me. So I could not do anything but choose London as number 3 on my list.
And I totally agree. The reason that I had it as low on my list as I did was mostly because I almost felt it was somewhat cheating to put it on there, because it wasn't a one-off or even a two-off location. It was one that, it's always there. But I totally agree. It could have easily been number 1 on my list as easily as it was number 9 on my list, just because there is so much history there. And it is Bond. You think of Bond, you think of London and England, because that's who he is and that's what he is. So I don't fault your judgment at all, sir.
All right. And that brings us each to our top 2. And I have to wonder if they're both the same. I am positive that at least one of them is the same. Interesting to see if they're in the same order. And I'm sure that anyone who has listened to more than 2 episodes of the show has a prediction as to what my selection will be. And I am pretty sure Eric has this same prediction. Am I correct?
That I would be willing to bet that is my prediction. So do we want to go ahead and skip to number 1, or since there's so many options available that could have not been mentioned, we could go 2, then 1? What do you want to do?
Oh, let's do number 1. And who wants to go first? I'll let you make that decision.
You know what? I want to hear from you if I was correct in my assessment of what you would pick as number 1. So go ahead.
Okay. Now, as noted, I went by some specific criteria when choosing my thrilling cities, and amongst them was how well the city was represented in the films, and also how relevant it was to James Bond. And I am going to make anyone who placed a bet lose a ton of money, because my number 1 thrilling city from the James Bond franchise, it's not Constantinople, it's Istanbul. Damn it. And, if you wonder why Constantinople got the works, that's a question you got to ask Turks.
It's nobody's business but the Turks, so how about you just leave them be? Oh my goodness. All right, so, wow. Yep, I lost big on that one. But it's a good thing I was following Fleming's own rules on gambling, and I did not bet an amount of money that was significant to me in any way, shape, or form. So, I was incorrect. My prediction for your number 1 was different. Now, your number 1 happens to be my number 2. So, why don't we talk about Istanbul just a little bit, since it's right there at the top, near the top of both of our lists.
For me, it is, and Fleming himself, both as a person, even though personally you can tell, both through his author's voice and through comments he's made, he doesn't like the city. And yet, in fact, he's called it too Asiatic. and yet it is one of the iconic, absolute iconic locations for espionage and going back even further to noir. It is the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and it's just such a wonderful setting for any kind of espionage movie. It's the starting point of the Orient Express, and it's been used in multiple James Bond movies to such gorgeous effect. Like most recently in Skyfall, the wonderful chase across the bazaar with the Hagia Sophia, one of the most beautiful buildings on the face of the earth, in the background, and a church that we actually got to visit in From Russia with Love, where so much of the action takes place in Istanbul, because of course that's where they make the switch for him to pick up the Lecter. And then also you have the action at the Bosphorus in The World Is Not Enough. So 3 different times we've seen this amazing city put to wonderful effect, and you get just a great flavor for it. And it's just so espionage noir iconic. I could not overlook the significance with a capital S of Istanbul,
right?
Not Constantinople.
Istanbul was once Constantinople. That's all we know. Yes, I agree. It's just a fantastic city. It's a fantastic location. Specifically for me was the chase scene in Skyfall. Just the amazing use of that location, and that just everything about that city just led itself perfectly to that scene, and I found it just absolutely enthralling. And like you said, it's not the first time we've seen Istanbul in a Bond movie, and hopefully it won't be the last time we see Istanbul in a Bond movie. So, again, definitely an easy number 2 pick for me and number 1 for you. So I'm wondering if then we flip-flopped our 1 and 2 positions.
I am positive that we did.
So for me, my number 1 pick, the one that I predicted would be your number 1 pick, because I know it's your number 1 pick in real life for cities. So
yes, it is absolutely my favorite city on earth. In fact, I will be spending New Year's Eve there, and all I'll say is if you like jazz, you might even be able to find me.
There you go. So, of course, we're talking about good old San Francisco, California. Just a fantastic use of the location, specifically in A View to a Kill. You gotta love blimp at the Golden Gate Bridge. A blimp running into the Golden Gate. Oh my gosh, it's such a fantastic scene in an otherwise forgettable movie, pretty much. But in general, it's just a fantastic use of the location, and for me, just the first thing that popped into my head when I thought about cities James Bond has been to, the first image that flies into my head is of a blimp and the Golden Gate Bridge. It couldn't not be number 1 for me, just because immediately when thinking of this list, that was the first thing that popped into my head.
And I can't question your judgment, because as everyone who's ever listened to this knows, that is my favorite city on the face of the planet. I love San Francisco. And in A View to a Kill, they make such beautiful use of it. And it was granted because the mayor of the city at the time, now Senator Dianne Feinstein, was a fan of Roger Moore. And when she found out that a Bond movie was wanted to film in San Francisco and Roger Moore was still playing Bond, she basically said, give them whatever they want. So they had unprecedented access to everything. So you had the Golden Gate Bridge, but before that, you had the San Francisco Civic Center, which is their city hall, which also happens to be the site of the original United Nations before it went to New York. You have a fantastic chase scene through the city, which actually looks like a chase scene through the city. It's taking advantage of the streets and the just incredible terrain and ridiculous hills. And you just get such a great flavor for the physical city of San Francisco that if it weren't for the iconic nature of Istanbul as an espionage city, I mean, my own prejudices alone would have made San Francisco win for me, but I had to try and be at least a little objective. So San Francisco is number 2 on this list, but overall I agree with Tony Bennett.
But number 1 in your heart.
Exactly.
All right. Well, there you have it. Our top 10 cities, thrilling cities in the James Bond film universe. We'd love to hear what some of your top cities are, or what you think is your favorite city that James Bond has ever been to. I don't care if it was in the books, in the movies. Let us know. Hit us up on our Facebook page, facebook.com/HerMajesty'sPod. Tweet us at HerMajesty'sPod. You can email me. I'm Eric at 4eyeradio.com, or follow me on the Twitter at Eric J. Dewey.
You can also email me at ziggy@cinemaontherocks.com. You can also find me on Twitter at cinemaotr. And before we go, just one quick question. If there is one city that you know Bond has not visited yet that you would like to see him go to, is there one that pops out in your mind that you'd like to see?
The only thing that immediately pops into my head would be like my hometown. Like I'd love to see Bond in Flagstaff, Arizona, just because I'd be like, hey, look, I know that place, and I know that place, and I know that place. Hey, you just passed by my old house that I grew up in. That's the first thing that pops into my head. But if I gave it some more thought, I could probably think of something more thrilling and dramatic. But that's the first thought I always have is like, it would be so awesome to see Bond someplace I know personally.
I'm actually going to agree with you. However, I have the extra backing of the fact that it is also one of the more cosmopolitan cities in North America. It also just happened to formerly be a hometown of mine. I lived there for several years, and I would like to see him go to Vancouver, British Columbia.
Ah, there you go.
It's a former British Empire city, of course, technically British Commonwealth still. Gorgeous city, very cosmopolitan, lots of reasons for him to possibly go there, lots of great locations. For those who are unfamiliar with Vancouver, if you watched the 2010 Olympics at all, you saw a lot. You have the iconic Canada Place building where the cruise ships leave from. It's got the sails on the top. You have the Lionsgate Bridge, which is the narrow green bridge from which the Golden Gate Bridge would take its inspiration. You've got a wonderful harbor and bay that just begs for a boat chase. You've got just all kinds of great architecture, great streets you can go through. I can imagine Vancouver being a fantastic place for Bond.
All right, fair enough. So that's it. Bond, next film, after Spectre, make sure that you're filming in Vancouver and Flagstaff, Arizona. There we go. Somehow we'll make this work. So do you have anything else to add about thrilling cities before we sign off for this episode?
Just as kind of hinted to earlier, I'm kind of surprised New Orleans didn't make my list. I was sure it would when I first started putting it together. Another one that I thought would make the list that didn't was Nassau, the Bahamas. But somehow that just... It made it at number 11 is what it turned out to be. Because that's one of those we visited more than once, and you got enough of a flavor of the city, but it just somehow kept going off to the wayside. Mm-hmm. So those were the two big surprises for me that hadn't been mentioned yet.
All right. Well, nothing really shocked me. I think we hit everything that I would have thought of. I'm kind of surprised at myself that Vegas didn't make it, and also surprised that I didn't think of St. Petersburg at the time. Like, the name just escaped me, and so I thought it wasn't that important. But then thinking back, I'm like, no! I'm now looking at my list going, I have nothing from GoldenEye. What's wrong with me?
Yeah, no kidding. Go have a drink.
I know, right?
But that is going to do it for our Thrilling Cities episode. We hope it has thrilled you. And join us next time for our last episode of 2014, if you're going to be listening to these relatively close to drop order. And we promise that it will be fun for the whole family. Dun, 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 dun. That's your hint.
Yes. As long as scum doesn't stop us, or something doesn't stop us.
Yeah, but they always try. They do. But in any case, I'm Ziggy Berkeley.
And I'm Eric Dewey.
And you have been listening to Her Majesty's Secret Podcast, only on the Four-Eyed Radio Network.
This has been another great presentation by the Four-Eyed Radio Network. You can find more information at foureyedradio.com.